you may be aware there's a famous historian, Patricia Kroner, Danish originally, and she wrote quite a few kind of controversial articles, books about the early history of Islam. And the interesting thing is these haven't really been borne out by archaeology, hasn't really confirmed any of her ideas. In fact, it's kind of done the opposite to a certain extent. So
Peace, people, and welcome to another installment of Real Talk with Tehran and Roxana. In this episode, we're going to dig up the dirt on Islam and go deep into the fascinating world of archaeology and explore the rich heritage of early Islamic Baṣra. The archaeology of Islam is a topic we rarely hear about because it's a field that often resides in the shadows or is overshadowed by other areas of study concerning the development of Islam and its history. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce a true luminary in the field of Islamic archaeology, Professor Andrew Petersen. Thank you, sir, for agreeing to share with us your wealth of experience and deep insights. And just to go over your background a little bit, Professor Petersen is the Director of Research in Islamic Archaeology at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, and has worked in and carried out research in a number of countries of the Middle East and Africa. These countries include Jordan, Iraq, Palestine, Turkmenistan, the UAE, Oman, Syria, Qatar, Kenya, and Tanzania. He has also worked in British archaeology with the specialty in recording standing buildings. So, Professor Petersen, what got you into archaeology, and what aspects of Islamic archaeology originally sparked your interest and led you to want to specialize in this particular academic discipline?
Oh, right, good. Thank you. Yeah, first of all, thank you for the introduction, and also thank you for the question, because this is a question which I often ask myself, but it's got a very direct kind of personal sort of story attached to it, which is well, one thing I suppose I should say that I started off studying philosophy at university. That's what I was interested in, and obviously philosophy is very interesting. It deals with fundamental questions, but after a while, I felt that for me, in any case, for me, it was more about investigating the types of questions rather than actually looking for answers. There was for me anyway. I'm sure for real philosophers that you don't have this, but for me, it was simply a question of looking at different people's arguments and how they sort of looked at the world, and there seemed to me no real prospect of really advancing anywhere in there, getting new information or new insights. So that's why I suppose I sort of began to be interested in archaeology as something which actually has sort of some tangible evidence. You're actually getting new information, new results, things which can kind of inform your idea of the world. And then the particular aspect of why Islamic archaeology. First of all, I suppose I should say when I started studying archaeology, I also at the same time I studied medieval history, and I was fortunate in having Hugh Kennedy as a lecturer, and he introduced me to Islamic history, and then I kind of thought of the idea of maybe combining Islamic history with archaeology. And just one further thing, which is probably worth mentioning, I think from a personal perspective, is I grew up in Cardiff, which is a kind of has lots, well, at that time anyway, it had lots of students from all over the place, and a lot of them were from the Middle East. And we had some flats next to us, and I used to talk to the people there, and they're people from Libya, from Jordan, from Iraq, different places, Iran. And as a child, I just used to talk to these people. So I sort of became interested in their culture and their heritage, because to me it seemed like different but not different, familiar but also like very interesting and different. So that's kind of my my own reason for being interested. Now,
Okay.
as I said, yeah, sorry.
No. Continue.
As I said, I think one of the things that's probably worth emphasizing is that Islamic archaeology has only recently begun to be seen as like a coherent discipline within archaeology. Like, and it's still evolving. And for me, the fascinating thing about it is that there's a lot of things to investigate that haven't really been looked at. So there's plenty of material to look at, and so the possibility of interesting results.
Oh, definitely. And when I found out that archaeology, specifically in the Hejaz region, where the two holy sites are, there hasn't been a lot of archaeology, if any, in that region. Really, just makes me wonder what kind of results would turn out if there was to, if some kind of archaeological research was to happen in that region. And you mentioning Hugh Kennedy, I think he might have been an introduction to Islamic history for a lot of us. I remember when I really became interested in Islamic history, Hugh Kennedy was someone, a name that constantly popped up. And I remember trying to find anything he was speaking about on BBC in our time or any other programs that they had. And so, yeah, he's a really interesting, enlightening figure, historian to read concerning Muslim history. And for me, archaeology actually has a bit of sentimental value. Just to bring up, Jurassic Park came out about 30 years ago in June, and my birthday was in June, and I remember going to see it for my birthday, and that had a profound effect on me to where I went into first grade, like, and so enthused about dinosaurs. They had a book in my classroom. I would read it all the time. My teacher had given me that book at the end of the year as a present. And from there, I thought I was going to be an archaeologist. Yeah, fast forward, things have
Yeah.
changed, but I still hold that memory dear to me. So can you please briefly introduce the field of archaeology of Islam and its significance in understanding the history of the Islamic world? You just mentioned that only now is it starting to be seen as a coherent discipline, and I think because of that, not too many people are familiar of what the archaeology of Islam involves.
Okay, so first of all, I think one of the things that's worth establishing, certainly from my point of view at the beginning, is that, and this is something that I've talked to various people about, that there is a view amongst some people that Islamic archaeology, or the archaeology of Islam, is something which is really something to do with maybe just Muslims. It's something that only Muslims can do. And I think I can see how you could get to that idea, but for me, I think to be a discipline, it has to be the identity of the researcher should be kind of secondary, and we're talking about kind of like a real scientific inquiry, something which is so, like, my personal beliefs about religion or anything should be taken out of it, and it should be really a very much a scientific inquiry. So that's the first thing I think is worth saying. I mean, that having said that, I should say that I also think personally that it's important to have some kind of sympathy or interest, so like some sort of sympathy and knowledge of contemporary Muslim people and the religion. I think that's also important, because I think to really get the best from the study, the archaeology, the results, you really need to have that understanding, and that understanding comes from a sort of an understanding of how and why people believe have their beliefs. So that's kind of and in terms of its significance for understanding the history of the Islamic world, I suppose if you look at historical accounts are good, and they can be useful. This is written documents from different places, but I think one of the frustrating things which you find about historical documents is quite often they don't really talk about things that you might be interested in, or they leave things out because to the people at the time these things are self-evident, like what Basra looked like, for example, in the 7th century. Somebody writing in Basra would have thought, well, I know what it's like, why should I describe it? So things like that. that's one thing. And then the other thing, of course, is that people writing history may start as oral history, but it becomes sometimes the history is written later. And then the other thing is, as we all know, whenever anybody tells a story, tells somebody some information, it changes slightly when it's passed on to somebody else. It's kind of inevitable, and also everybody puts their kind of own spin on it, their own interpretation. And so the good thing about archaeology is we're looking at physical evidence, and which we interpret in a scientific way. I mean, when I say a scientific way, some of this can be as basic as if you've got one thing on top of another, the thing below was there before the thing on top. That's kind of the basic thing about archaeology. And so in some way, the scientific rationale is kind of very simple. Sometimes you get more complicated stratigraphy with the lots of different layers. But that's really sort of quite straightforward. But of course, you'll probably be aware that a lot of the techniques we use nowadays kind of advance beyond this. And so we've got a range of sort of like high-tech methodologies for analyzing material. So people will probably be aware of things like carbon dating, and which is using bits of carbon, wood usually, or maybe animal bone for getting dates. Of things. But the important thing with all these highly specialized analytical techniques is you need to get the basics right. You need to understand, if you're using scientific methods, you really need to understand the physical context of where these things come. So in the words of one of my lectures, I remember, are you sure your date, do you know, are you sure you know what you're dating? Because what you're dating is important. You have to know exactly what you're dating, because otherwise it can be quite difficult. The other thing I'll just mention quickly, because I think it's an interesting discussion, and I'm not sure how Muslim people think about this. I mean, I've got kind of my own views, but is the potential for using DNA sequencing within archaeology. Now, this is a really big growth field in archaeology in general, of all different periods, and I was involved in a project where an excavation looking at a Neolithic site. So that's a site about 10,000 years old, a very ancient site. They're looking at an ancient site from the Middle East. And they had some humans, they had a cemetery from this date, and they excavated some individuals and they took them for DNA analysis. And then they found that unusually the DNA was very, very well preserved. And they did further analysis. So they did the entire sequencing, but then they found out that these were probably Muslim burials, and because they'd been buried within an earlier cemetery. And so from that, given that they'd already got the information, they asked me to have a look at it. And what was very interesting is it showed that, this is a site in Syria, it showed that the very first, one thing, it showed that Muslim burial traditions were adopted very early on. And the other thing, it showed that Muslims, these early Muslims, were people who were from the Arabian Peninsula. So there was actually, we know it wasn't just converts, that there were actual Bedouin Arabs, and they're identified as Bedouin as well, who actually came out very early. And these genes are slightly present in the modern day population of Syria, but only through the influx of these people. So that was very interesting. But I think it's something that is something worth thinking about for Islamic archaeology. I mean, I know there's some methodological problems and ethical issues, but I'd say it's certainly kind of interesting. Yeah. So yeah.
Since you mentioned carbon dating, I do have a question about carbon dating,
Yeah.
being that it seems to be a fairly recent way of analyzing to come to a certain date. How confident are you in that technology or that way of dating? Because I understand that they sometimes it can give a wide range, and I've also read that it's a fairly new, and some people within I don't want to say your field, but
Yeah.
surrounding your field might not have as much confidence.
Okay, yeah. Well, so first of all, carbon dating is one of, there are other analytical scientific dating methods. So we have things like thermoluminescence, which you can use on pottery, and we've also got hydrolyzation. There's a range of things. But to return to carbon dating, basically, just to explain how it works, if you get a piece of as I say, animal bone usually, or wood. What you do is there's the carbon that's absorbed. There's a certain amount of carbon that decays at a certain rate into a different type of carbon, and that's kind of the base. And that rate, that starts when a tree or a living organism dies. So what you can do is you can measure the amount of carbon 14 in your sample, and compare that to what there would be in that sample if it was still alive. And the less carbon 14 there is, that means the older it is. That's the basic principle. And there have been recent developments in carbon dating. So basically nowadays you need the sample size is smaller, and what you have to do to collect the samples is a bit simpler. Before it was very difficult. So that's kind of the basic methodology. In terms of its accuracy, yeah, there are problems. There are problems for really deep, for very, very old, I'm not sure of the exact date, but very, very old sites. So I'd say for like Neolithic sites, you can kind of use it, but it's kind of on the edge. And also for very recent sites, so 19th century sites are also difficult. So the important thing, if you're reading any archaeological report which mentions carbon dating, the results you've got, and I got some carbon dating from Basra, the results you get back from the lab, and I used the lab in California, the results you get back, they give you a range of dates and their likely probability. So, and if you see in a report, it's presented in this way, then it's likely to be kind of reliable. So it'll give you, say, a date of like, what it will do is maybe give you a date of like, say, 500 AD plus or minus 50 with a probability of 90%, and then 10% probability of another date. So it gives you a range. So you as a reader can actually understand the reliability of the date you're given. So for me, it's pretty reliable, I think. You just need to, yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I had read something about carbon dating in a recent book called Creating the Quran, where the person tried to just bring up that it's fairly new. And I just saw this as an opportunity to ask
Yeah, yeah.
someone who deals with it. What are some key archaeological sites related to the early development and spread of Islam? And what insights have they provided about this period? I mean, you already mentioned one about the burial and then the influx
Yeah,
from the Arabian Peninsula.
yeah,
Something, a theory. I don't know if it's maybe it's widespread.
yeah,
A lot of people accepted that, yeah, there was an influx of people coming from the Arabian Peninsula outward during this period for whatever reasons.
yeah.
But do you know of any other archaeological sites, or is this one one of key importance concerning
Um,
the spread and development of Islam?
okay, yeah. So there's quite a few sites that are, well, many sites that are kind of really important for the study of Islam. I mean, I should say, just as kind of like as an aside here, um, a lot of people who've worked on, let's say, the early Islamic period in archaeological terms, a lot of the people have been primarily interested in, say, let's say, things like palaces and fortifications, particularly from, let's say, the Umayyad period. and that's fine, and that tells you a lot about, like I'd say, society, culture, and stuff. But it doesn't really necessarily tell you so much about, let's say, the religious, the belief systems that were kind of in place. So a lot of effort has been spent on looking at, like, say, Umayyad sites in Syria and Jordan, and because they are very interesting cultural artifacts, and they tell you a bit about certainly the elite, the ruling culture, the ruling people at this time.
Yeah,
But
Roxanne and I had we were talking about the Umayyad palaces not long ago, and we were
yeah,
kind of shocked by some of the art that they had in these palaces. I would have never expected it.
yeah. I mean, that is all very interesting, and is kind of, I think it represents, a certain sector of society, and also I'd say it's probably to do with uh, it's a kind of like a hybrid culture where you've also got like elements of the existing kind of civilization or whatever it was, and so it kind of incorporates both. But and that's why I'll just mention it again briefly, why that burial was really important, because these people were buried using I mean, the excavators didn't recognize it at the time, but because they thought they were digging up a Neolithic site, but the people were buried on their sides with their heads toward Mecca. And so the fact that this Muslim burial was as an idea, as a concept, that the practice was established. And the dates for this, by the way, are late 7th century, so about 690s or something like that for that burial. But so that's quite interesting. The other sort of not exactly a single site, but range of sites which are quite interesting are a range of small mosques which have been kind of identified in many different places, actually. So you get them in Jordan, you get some in Palestine, in the Negev, that area, which Israelis have had problems knowing how to deal with them, but there's certainly a lot there. And also to do with some work of doing in Qatar, is also in Qatar. So I think they're kind of quite widespread, these small, and some of them can be like open air mosques. Some of them may have had more substantial structures, but some of these are kind of very early. And I think these say a bit about the practice of prayer, and the practice of that this was established kind of very early on and was adopted over a huge area. I suppose that's what's interesting, over a huge area. Which reminds me, I'll just say, is out of sequence, but I should also say, in terms of burials, and I think the people sort of watching this will be interested, and you can find it online, is one of the few other examples of early Islamic burials is some burials which were discovered at Nîmes in France. So this is next to Nîmes was a Roman city, and then its status after the Roman period is it was part of this kind of kingdom. And amongst a whole load of burials there, which were mostly, I think they're Visigothic. They were like, were they Christian? I'm not sure, but they certainly weren't Muslim. Amongst a whole lot of people buried, probably in conflict, they found 2 burials which were Muslim burials, which is quite interesting. And again, they performed a range of analysis of these. And again, they found that these people were probably from North Africa originally, and they're buried, and they thought they were probably fighting in the military of this territory in southern France. So that's quite interesting. So yeah,
So I'll
that's
take it that's probably around 8th century, being that I think that's around the time when they were encroaching into
yeah,
France
but
out of
it's
Iberia.
quite early 8th century, which is quite interesting about early. So it's similar date to what we had in Syria, but it's interesting again. So you're looking at a huge area with similar burial practices is I think sort of quite interesting. Yeah.
And are there any particular artifacts or discoveries that have shed new light on important events or figures in early Islamic history? I mean, you kind of answered that
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
with the burial
yeah,
practices. So, I
yeah.
mean, you don't have to reiterate unless there's anything else.
I mean, I suppose the one thing I suppose the one thing I would say is that in terms of actual personalities, let's say people that may have been um, discovered, we haven't, in terms of archaeology, we haven't really found anything that really relates to one famous like person in terms of religious sort of significance. We haven't, that's never actually been, never really found that kind of association. We found reflections of events which we know from early Islamic history, but we haven't actually found, yeah, anything to do with named people particularly that I can think of at the moment anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
Related to that, I mean, do you find, in general, in terms of your work, the
Yeah.
archaeological findings that you conclude with, do they sort of complement or often challenge traditional historical accounts of the rise of Islam?
Well, yeah, yeah, so that's a good question, and it's it's quite interesting because I think one of the I was going to say problems, but one of the realities of the way that archaeology is carried out and the way and early Islamic history is that I suppose they're sort of like parallel, and they in some ways they're looking at maybe the same period, but some of these things don't often intersect. So you don't often get direct reflections of what you know from Islamic history. There are some exceptions, but it's interesting. So you're getting a different range of information from archaeology than you are from history. It's a different type of information. And occasionally there are overlaps. But really it's almost like they're looking at different things, really. So it's like providing, I suppose what I'd say is that to me it seems like the archaeology provides context for the historical information. It provides you with an idea of, as I say, things like what it was like where people lived and what kind of conditions were they wealthy? Were they poor? Were they nomads? Were they not? Things like that. So it's a different range of kind of questions. Having said that, I'd say a lot of the okay, yeah. Well, I was going to say a lot of the information for this early period is kind of, in historical terms, there have been historians who've questioned the validity of some of the early Islamic history, and but actually in the most of these, for example, there have been people who've suggested that for the first years Islam wasn't really it was very different from what it was later, and that it's later remodeled and reformed, and all previous versions of the history were kind of erased. And whilst we know that there was certain historical revisions, things like the burials which I referred to and other facts show that really actually there was quite a good understanding of what Islam was, certainly in its basics. I'm not a religious historian, but certainly in its basics. So you're not talking about like kind of fundamental differences, like there's a completely different religion up until, you know, up until the Umayyad period or in the Umayyad period, and it completely changed. We're not talking about that. It's just that maybe the way people, it's just the emphasis may have been different. So I think that's quite interesting. I'd say archaeology, what archaeology has done, it's confirmed that in terms of religion, there's the basic outlines of its early history, as we know from historical documents, seems to be kind of correct. I mean, you may be aware there's a famous historian, Patricia Kroner, Danish originally, and she wrote quite a few kind of controversial articles, books about the early history of Islam. And the interesting thing is these haven't really been borne out by archaeology. Hasn't really confirmed any of her ideas. In fact, it's kind of done the opposite to a certain extent. So archaeology has been able to provide kind of that, yeah, it's shown that her ideas are sort of hypotheses of things that could have been, but actually the archaeology has said this is, it seems to indicate this is less likely. This is less likely. So the whole thing about Mecca example as the everything we know from archaeology tends to support the, in general, the traditional Muslim historiography, I'd say. I mean, there are a few things which I can't think of at the moment where there may be some differences, but in general, it doesn't really, archaeology doesn't really conflict with the Muslim traditions.
Interesting, very interesting.
And in terms of, I mean, you mentioned earlier about the sort of difficulty around being a researcher in Islamic studies who doesn't come from a faith background, a particular faith background. But in terms of the other sort of challenges and limitations of sort of conducting archaeological research in Islamic regions, what are they in terms of sort of things like access to sites and interpretations of findings and things like that?
Okay, yeah, and again, a good question. I'd say, first of all, each country, each region has its own challenges and differences. Obviously, Iraq has its own challenges. It's kind of been getting better, touch wood, but it's been Iraq has its own challenges, and then somewhere like Jordan, for example, which is kind of stable, that's obviously kind of easier, I suppose. But I'd say for me personally, one of the big challenges in terms of things like getting funding for work, simply because a lot of the funding that you get in the UK, or that's available, international funding, there's a lot of money is spent on, let's say, Egyptology and also the early history and archaeology of Iraq. And all of these I support. I think that's good. But really the resources available to study archaeology of Islam are kind of much more limited, because I suppose if we're thinking about, let's say, Britain, I mean, obviously it's much more multicultural now, but if we're thinking about in the past, let's say, I don't know, pre-war or something, the perception is that the interest in let's say the Middle East or the Islamic world is in the pre-Islamic culture, because somehow, and I don't know if you've heard of Edward Said, who wrote this book Orientalism, this way that the West has always was interested in the archaeology of these regions, but interested in seeing it as like kind of a background for so-called Western civilization. And so it might be interesting to look at sort of, Egypt, even up to Coptic Egypt and the ancient civilizations of Rome and things like this. But then the Islamic civilizations, for some reason, were not considered relevant to what let's say what British civilization used to be, and is considered as something that's like, well, that doesn't really concern us. Interestingly, I'll just throw this in. Interestingly, I did, when I worked in Turkmenistan a while ago, which is one of the former countries of the Soviet Union. When I worked there, interestingly, the Soviets had a similar attitude towards the archaeology of that like Central Asia, where they left the pre-Islamic stuff they thought was of interest and importance, and the Islamic period for Central Asia, the Russians kind of left to the Turkmen archaeologists and didn't really fund themselves, because they thought this has nothing to do with our. So that there is, but fortunately now there is a lot more. There's a growing interest in looking at the archaeology of this kind of later period, Islamic period, but there's still the institutional challenges of, I suppose, kind of funding And so that's sort of from this thing. I just need to say, I'll just say one other kind of challenge that we have with archaeology, which is yeah, and I'll sort of kind of mention this as somebody who's not. I mean, I feel very close to Islam because I've had a lot to do with it, but I'm not Muslim, so I feel in some ways that's kind of possibly problematic, but actually in practice I found it in a way it makes things easier, because I'm aware that, like with Christianity, there's different views within Islam about what's important, who did this, who did what. And I feel as somebody who's not from this background, I can be kind of neutral. To me, these divisions are, they don't matter. I have no particular view on various interpretations of Islamic history. So I feel in a way I can be kind of more, I can go into this in a way, I don't worry about what I'm saying, because what I'm saying doesn't come from, I haven't got a predetermined view about things. So I'd say it's actually kind of an asset in a way.
Definitely.
So you sort of know, having no particular dog in the fight does sort of
Yeah,
help
that's
a little
right.
bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it.
And in terms of that's actually really interesting, because we often talk on this channel about the idea of a sort of a many Islams, the diversity in Islamic thought. And how have you found archaeology in particular? Have you found that it has played a role in unraveling that a little bit, about sort of the diversity in terms of religion, culture, and the social aspects of Islamic civilization?
Yeah, I'd say, well, one thing that's, I mean, you can get this if you look at some documents and stuff, but one of the interesting things is, I'd say, probably the coexistence not only of different types of Islam, but also different faiths living in, I'm talking about the Middle East primarily here, about people living in the same kind of environment side by side. And there's this idea which does to a certain extent happen, which means you get quarters of different groups. So you get Muslims living in one area and Christians in another, and Jews in another, and they're kind of very separate. But you also get examples of people living very much side by side, I mean, next door to each other. And so I'd say the idea of kind of coexistence is and diversity is kind of very very much there within the archaeological record. And also I'd say there's cultural diversity within them, cultural, not necessarily religious as well maybe, but also cultural diversity within the Muslim communities in the past. So consideration of how you organize, well, burials is a good one, but also the form of your mosque, how you organize your life, all of this varies quite a lot. There are certain fundamentals, but there's also kind of quite a lot, like you were talking about the let's say the Umayyad palaces, for example, which have things which you may find quite surprising. Yet what's interesting, so that there's those, but then within their mosques they don't have figural decoration. So there's this idea of, there's a great deal of diversity, but I can kind of see, from having spent a long time looking at this, there's certain sort of like deep things which kind of remain the same no matter what, throughout history, which is interesting, I think. So I'd say, yeah, there's a very strong continuity, both in terms of space, from East Africa, in terms of my own personal experience, from East Africa to like Bulgaria and stuff. There's a very strong continuity of ways of doing things, I suppose. Yeah.
And we were hoping that with that you could kind of show us archaeology and practice with Basra and the work that you've done in that city, which is a city that Roxana and I, maybe more so myself, I don't want to just speak for Roxana,
Yeah,
but we find Basra to be one of the most fascinating Islamic cities to have existed. I mean, when you
yeah,
look
yeah.
at some of the things, the events that have happened in the city, and then also some of the figures who have come out of the city. It's just totally fascinating. And to our surprise, when we ran a poll on our social media on what city do our audience believe to have had the most cultural impact in early Islamic history, out of a range of 4 cities, I think it was Medina, Damascus, Kufa, and Basra. People saw Basra as having contributed the least to the
Wow.
cultural
Yeah,
history of Islam in this
yeah.
early period. So, and that's exactly what we brought you here for, because
Brilliant.
your presentation, which you have elsewhere,
Yeah,
definitely tells a different story.
yeah, yeah. Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Basra is like, yeah, it's very interesting, and I think, yeah, this is interesting actually. One of the things I think is worth mentioning about Basra, because it kind of illustrates some of what we've already been talking about in terms of history, archaeology. Um, and I'm not a specialist, but I've read about the history of Basra in the early Islamic period for my work, and yeah, and it's cultural, religious, philosophical. You know, its importance in this way is immense. But what's quite interesting in terms of archaeology, which are okay, hardly any archaeology has been carried out in Basra. That's one thing. There has been a bit which I'll talk about and hopefully show you some pictures, but hardly any archaeology has been carried out in Basra. But archaeologists working on the early Islamic period in, let's say, the Gulf, in places like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, and further afield throughout the Indian Ocean, really. Basra is really important archaeologically, even if you don't know anything about the culture that took place, because it was this great Indian Ocean trading port, and is really the connecting point between, let's say, Mediterranean civilization, which at that point was Islamic, but Mediterranean civilization and the Indian Ocean world. And so we're connecting Asia with Europe, really, through the port of Basra. So, and in terms of things that were produced there, it's very, very important. And so for people who aren't archaeologists, for people who are archaeologists, Basra is important as the invention place of lots of new types of ceramics and objects, material culture, trading objects. So it's really important as a trading place. So we know there's certain types of pottery which are highly innovative technologically, which probably started in Basra. So we have there's a type of pottery called whiteware, which is imitates Chinese porcelain, and we know Chinese white porcelain was being imported, and you find I might show you some examples. You find some examples of whiteware and Chinese porcelain in the same place, and we actually found this in Basra. And so this is a place where they invented a new way of doing pottery and a new form of glazing, tinner pacified glazing. But anyway, this pottery, so you get the pottery, Islamic pottery, imitating Chinese pottery that was then exported widely and was found in places like, for example, East Africa, Tanzania. So you get the Iraqi pottery exported down there. So and then you get variations on there. You get lusterware and you get all sorts of things. So this really shows this parallel thing I was saying about you've got the people interested in Islam as a faith and its history, yet culturally it was also, you get this other information just at what an important technological trading post Basra was. So yeah, so it has kind of both those things. So if I'll just hang on. I'm just going to think. What I could do quickly, if it's of interest, I could just show you a few pictures of Basra.
Please.
And also explain a little bit about it, because for Basra, the city of Basra, there's a fundamental thing which needs to be understood in terms of its archaeology, which most people are unaware of because it's not their job, basically. And so I'll just get my PowerPoint up and see if I can. Right. So I can do that from beginning. And now I need to make that, hang on, escape. Okay, so can I share a presentation? I think that's how you meant to do it, isn't it? Actually, we don't necessarily need the photos. I'm not quite. Oh, share screen. Yeah, that's it. Share screen. Oh, apparently. Okay.
Oh, would I have to make you the host?
It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So I don't know who the.
Here you go. There, it should be available to you.
Okay, right. Thanks. Good. So share screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see. Can you see this? What? Maybe you can just see my screen.
Yes.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Islamic Baṣra. Okay, good. So this is from probably a slightly longer presentation, so I'll try and sort of go through it quite quickly. This is just obviously a map just to show you the location of Basra for anybody who's unaware. So Basra is located at the head of the Persian Gulf, head of the Gulf, and it's a very interesting location, actually. So it's also where these famous rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, come together. So there's a lot of things. So what I was saying about bringing the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean worlds together, these rivers really connect Basra by water with the Mediterranean area, roughly. So you're able to bring, and interestingly, up in the 18th and 19th century, Britain used the Euphrates as a main river for connecting with India as well. So it's sort of very important in those terms. The other thing I should say is, okay, that's just showing the same map, really. Okay, I'll just skip these. These are just pictures of Kufa, which I could talk about again, but I don't really. Okay, Basra. So the important thing to say about Basra is that the modern city of Basra, so if you flew to Basra airport, if you went to Basra today, the present day city is not the same as the early Islamic city. That's the main thing to say. And the early Islamic city was located is located in a place that today is known as Zubayr, which is about 15 kilometers southwest of Basra. So this was the site of the early Islamic city. And because of changes in the route of the river over the last 1,500 years, they moved the city to the main river bed. But at the time that they founded Basra, it was actually there's a waterway leading from Khora Zubayr, which you see marked here. That waterway actually led all the way up to Zubayr and back into the river system. So it was actually located on a navigable river, or a canal, in fact. And so that kind of explains its kind of situation. So that's the main thing I'd like people to be aware of, that it's a different location to modern Basra. And in archaeological terms, this is just some pictures. These are just the Ottoman city of Basra, just some views of it, just the type of architecture. And this is, yeah, you don't really need this. I'm just going to try and move on a bit. Okay, so this is a schematic map of Basra, probably derived originally from the work of the French historical geographer Massillon. And it just shows this idea from the historical texts of what Basra was. So it's divided into 5 areas, khums, based on the tribal groups. So and you can see this is this Nahar Abula, the Abula River. But basically, this river would have connected to the river which I showed you on the previous slide. So this would have connected it to the sea. So it had its own waterways. But this is kind of a schematic map based on the text, and it just shows how people think the city was organized.
And getting water to Old Basra was of great difficulty.
Yes, yeah. It is a real problem to get fresh water. I mean, one of the things that's, yeah, again, this is really important actually. One of the interesting things about Basra is, and this applies to the modern city of Basra and the old city, is that okay, it was connected by waterway to the Persian Gulf, which sounds good, but actually in terms of drinking water, it's not very good, because it means with the tide, the seawater moves in because there's not much difference in height. So you actually get salt water coming in. So that was actually kind of one of the problems. So there was a big problem of getting fresh water to the old city.
What made it so appealing as a military encampment, which I believe was one of the first reasons why it was established?
Yeah. So yeah, the important thing is, and this is I'll say, this is my understanding of why it was important. Is okay. First of all, southern Iraq was, I mean, it's maybe altered in very recent years, but was traditionally very very marshy, very sort of waterlogged, particularly when it was outside the summer. So like not a particularly great environment to base an army or to travel through, not a great area to travel through. Lots of mosquitoes, like sort of kind of problematic. So that was one thing. And so when the Arab armies, when they first came out of Arabia, and they go, and Basra, we know, was one of the camps used for conquering Central Asia, Khorasan and things like this. One of the problems, according to the historians anyway, was that one of the problems was that the Arabs like to leave their families within Arabia, I suppose, and that's really the attraction of the site. Is Basra is in Mesopotamia, is in modern day Iraq, but it's also part of the Arabian desert, very definitely, and it's kind of that mixture which makes it. It means that for those early Muslims, most of whom were Arabs, for those early Muslims, these tribal groups, it meant that they could have a base within Arabia for their families, a place within Arabia where they could be based. Yet they could still go and do the conquests in Central Asia, and they could return to this base, which wasn't as far away. And also, I suppose, in possibly religious, cultural terms, is also important, because you can see from this map that the different different tribal groups had their kind of areas. And so you could maintain this as an Islamic city. So in one sense, and I've kind of thought about this before, is in one sense, this was, you could say this is the first truly Islamic city, because unlike Medina, or possibly even Mecca in a way, which had existed before Islam, this is a new foundation. It emerged out of a camp. And from its origins, the people were already Muslim. So any configuration, however it was kind of built, arranged, was by Muslims. So it's got real importance, I'd say, in that way. This is actually from somewhere else, but this is in Iraq. It's just to show that the first buildings of we know from historians were built just out of reeds. They were like tents, basically, tents, maybe using palm trunks, which you can see here, and maybe just palm leaves for shade over these sort of roofing poles. Right, that's okay. This is from the Department of Antiquities. This just shows you the area, the site of Old Basra as it was in, I think, 1986. So this kind of shows you the and so the area which is hatched, that's the city of Zubayr, the modern town of Zubayr, which was founded on the site of Old Basra. But the rest of the area within the dotted lines is the area which the Antiquities Department there reserved as an archaeological site. So they knew that this is important. And here you can see kind of the overlap between the two, just some maps. Okay, this is a British map from, I think, 1920s showing Zubayr. And you see Al Jamia here. This is the site of the mosque, the congregational mosque. Right, we can skip that. What we did basically in terms of research there, we didn't do excavations, but we did a drone survey. We did to map the archaeological site as it exists. So this is one of the findings we had. So this is the basic result of our work, and this is using a drone. And this is very, very high resolution, which you can't see it at this stage. But so this is all of this area is the site of the old city, which has kind of been abandoned. And then one thing that's important to know is that since it was abandoned in about, let's say, most of it was abandoned by about the 11th century, there've been successive, there've been floods, and there's also been things like sandstorms. So if you're walking over this area, you don't really see bits of pottery and bits of buildings because they're kind of buried under this later thing. So there's not a lot to see on the surface, but any excavations and you do start to see things. So this is from our drone photographs map, and this shows the site of the early Islamic mosque, which was partially excavated by the Iraqis in the 1980s.
So concerning that mosque, I have a question.
Yes.
Would that mosque be Imam Ali Mosque?
Yes, this is the Imam Ali Mosque. They refer to it locally as Khatwa Imam Ali Mosque, which apparently is the footstep of. So this is the one that he actually worked. I was going to say worked in. He would have preached in. Yes, so founded.
Did that take any excavation? Was it apparent if you were walking through?
Yeah. I'll just show you now. I'll just skip to it because hang on. Yeah. So okay, this is a Royal Air Force photograph from, I think, in 1930s, and it shows that mosque that we're looking at, and it shows this tower just at the edge, and a small kind of shrine there. And this was known that even though the site got abandoned in about, let's say, about 11th century, people still knew the site of that this was the important site of the old city of Basra. And we know from a 16th century Turkish account, they still knew. So throughout history, it's never been forgotten, the site or this mosque. But the mosque was kind of destroyed. And this was kind of all that was left standing in the 1930s. But this is what the Iraqi excavations managed to establish. So this is basically their reconstruction of this early mosque. So and this again, some photographs of this is from their excavations. So these are the walls. So that tower that you saw was not actually a tower, it's actually the corner of where two walls meet. And then you can see some of the columns which would have supported the sanctuary here. So this is it today. It's been restored in that form. The brickwork and stuff, that's probably about 11th century. That's kind of the latest phase of the mosque.
Because that was going to be my next question. When I was looking at
Yeah,
the particular building that you're showing
yeah,
right now,
yeah,
some of the designs looked a little bit old, a little bit newer than
yeah.
from when the mosque should have been built.
Yeah. So this is kind of a little bit newer, and so this is another view. So you can see that tower. It's not the tall tower there, but the one kind of in the middle, the small tower. That was the tower you're looking at just below. And this big area in here that we're walking over, this is when we were looking at the site. This big area was like within the territory of the mosque. And what you can see here, you can see these kind of stone blocks. And we know from the history, this area is alluvial river area, and you don't get natural stone occurring. But you can see here all these bits of stone, which are actually columns. These are like columns made out of stone with a hole in the middle, with iron or lead metal holding them together. And so these would have supported the columns. And we know from, there's one historian mentions the early mosque, mentions that they had to bring stone to build the columns from Jebel Sanam, which is down closer to the Kuwaiti border. So these are actually relics of that, not the earliest mosque, but of one of the earlier mosques. So again, this is just kind of another view of the mosque here. And again, you can see the tower, the modern kind of shrine within it. And then that enclosed area. So that they've enclosed the whole area of the early Islamic mosque. The other thing I'd just draw your attention to here, you can see there's like kind of a water channel on the outside. For reasons which I might say later, I think this was this channel is much later than the mosque. It was dug to go around, so the mosque was already there, and when they made it go round there. And we think this is from this, as well as being a water channel, it may have been the boundary of the city in its latest phase when it kind of shrunk. We know that it shrunk by the 1100s. And there's just some views of that. I won't go into that too much. So this just shows you that mosque and the ancient water channel. Okay. Now the other thing which I draw your attention to is, so in the very far west of the area we surveyed, we found this feature here, which looks just like a bulldozed load of soil. It doesn't look like much. We spotted it on the aerial photograph, so we went to have a look at it. And as you get closer, you look at it and you see, I don't know if it's been cut through at this point, but in a way that's quite good. What you can see is that this is actually a mud brick wall, a wall made out of bricks. Well, not necessarily just bricks, but like shuttering, like modern reinforced concrete, perhaps, or concrete pouring. They made a mold with wood, then poured the liquid mud inside it, and they created this wall. So this is a wall, and we know from here again, you can see it is maybe a little bit better. You can see just the shape. It looks like there's a ledge, and then the wall. It's all kind of eroded a little bit. But we know, so this is probably, we haven't got dates for this, but we think this is, we didn't manage to get carbon dates for this, but we know the wall was built around the historic site of Basra in 722, so in the early 8th century. And so this is that wall. Again, you can see these blocks here. They're not exactly bricks, but they're these mud shuttered, and you can see the different layers. So that's the wall. And another view, and here you can just see one of the buttresses, semicircular buttresses, which are used as kind of decoration and reinforcement for the wall. And these sort of features are quite characteristic of early Islamic architecture. So it seems quite likely that this was this wall. And so this is just a summary of our results. So you can see the mosque here in green, and then the red line is the line of that wall, which we traced on older aerial photographs and also in our aerial mapping. So this was really the site of the early Basra. And then you can just see on the top of the screen, top and right under the screen, you can see lots of white. And if you look carefully at the white, you can see lines, and it's like kind of divisions, like a network, a grid. And this is probably the fields that were used for crops for the early Islamic city. And that area, it's hard to see from this photograph, but is lower. So that area would have been one that was flooded and semi-marshy and would have been irrigated. So that was the field systems. And so what we think happened when Basra at its largest, it encompassed this huge area and had all these big field systems. And then by the 1100s, they built that canal or ditch around it to reduce the size, but they didn't really need to defend this, have walls on the northwest side, because that area was liable to inundation. Incidentally, I was reading accounts when Britain invaded Iraq in the First World War from Iran. They came from Iran, and that is the winter time, and they ran into that problem of the whole area is really marshy. So all that white area in the winter, that will all be waterlogged. So that's kind of yeah, and that's just our team. So that's just yeah. So that's just a quick view of the city. So I'll stop sharing now. So hopefully that's given you just a quick view of the reality of the site of Old Basra.
That was really nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I particularly your discussion about sort of the rigors of the climate and the difficulties surrounding the supply of drinking water to Old Basra. That seems sufficient almost to prevent the original military encampment under Umar al-Khattab from developing into an important city. So what were the sort of political, economic, and social factors that led to its development and its later historical significance? Okay,
yeah. Well, I suppose the first thing is, and this is slightly confusing for people who aren't used to this thing, used to archaeology, I think, is that one thing, okay, so the old city of Basra, the city that was the first Islamic city, is located on the site we're just looking at, present-day Zubair. But the modern city of Basra, which is actually not that modern, which was founded in about, let's say, 1500s, perhaps a bit, no, it's actually earlier than that, but that is actually located on, and this is on or very close to, a pre-Islamic port called Uballa. So that was actually so I suppose in terms of sort of like why this site was chosen, why it's important, I'd say historically it was always important. Historically, this was always an important site. You had to have because in terms of that linking between the Indian Ocean and Iraq on the one hand, and the Middle East, a port here there's always going to be a port here, and so it's always going to kind of be important. So that's kind of why this area maintained its importance. And I'd say, why did the camp at Basra evolve into becoming a city? Why didn't it move somewhere else? I think there's a few things, and the one thing which is often forgotten or often not, it's easy to sort of think of, you conquer an area and you establish a new city, but actually, land, even desert land, land usually belongs to people. Like, so if they just taken over a bullet, that already belongs to people, and you don't really, even as an occupying army or whatever, however you see these early Muslim armies, you don't really, I mean, I don't think even the Russians, I don't think, it's not the sort of thing you do when you're invading, even if you're doing it in a very hostile way. You don't take people's private land and use it for yourself to do your own stuff. So I'd say one of the attractions of the site is that there wasn't already a city there. So the land was kind of free, it was available. and it doesn't appear to have been fields. And so it's kind of like a desert land, a type of land that nomads would have known and understood. So I think that was one of the things. The land was available, and it was kind of the type of land that they kind of liked, and that it wasn't marshy. So okay, there were problems with water, lack of fresh water, but on the other hand, it didn't get flooded every year. So that was kind of quite a good thing. And also in the historical accounts, that wall which I showed you, which is the desert boundary, let's say, of the city, there's a gate in there, and there's a long street outside the gate called Murbad, and that was the area where kind of trading took place between the people who lived there and Bedouin traders. And that was kind of like almost an umbilical cord, or a kind of cultural link between the inhabitants of Basra and the Arab Bedouin who they trade with. And so there's this real strong attachment. So I think what's interesting really for me, in a way, is that this earliest Islamic city is still very much connected with Arabia. It has to it really feels like it has to retain that link, even though it's right on the very edge. It kind of retains that link. And I think that's one reason why it kind of remained important. And I mean, I don't know much about this, but I know that, like, in terms of literature, like a lot of the pre-Islamic literature was kind of, preserved and written down in Basra, and I think the reason it was able to do that is because they still had that link to Arabia. And I think also, and this is possibly really important for Islamic civilization elsewhere, is that, again, the Arabic language was preserved. This was a place where Arabic was spoken. So this civilization was able to have its Arabic as its language from right in the start. So I suppose in some ways it's not, it's not necessarily ideal, particularly if you get water. Just as an interesting observation as well, though. You said, like, it doesn't have water, it didn't have easy access to water, and that was a problem. And that certainly was interesting. It just reminds me, I also have done some work on the city of Ramla in Palestine, and that was also like a Muslim new city. It's near the modern city of Tel Aviv, I suppose. But when that was founded, they had similar problems of lack of water because they're founding a new settlement. And I think that's sort of one of the problems you're always going to run into. If you're finding a new settlement, usually it's because naturally it wasn't a place that people would kind of settle. And so you'd have to engineer things to make it available to live in. But I think, yeah, they got around it, but in both cases, but it's still problematic. Yeah. And
you just sort of alluded there in your answer to sort of the intellectual activity that was occurring in Basra, and in particular in relation to language. So lots of things have been said about Basra by many sort of great Islamic scholars and non-Islamic scholars. So sort of Ibn Taymiyyah described it as the cradle of asceticism and mysticism. Louis Massignon sort of viewed it as the crucible in which Islamic culture assumed its form. Can you sort of explain to us a little bit about what sort of intellectual activity occurred in Basra during the 2nd and 3rd centuries that sort of led these scholars to viewing the city as so crucial to the development of Islam?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things is my understanding is, let's say, okay, a few things. One is, like, Basra is obviously kind of Arabic, but it's also in Mesopotamia, or next to Mesopotamia. And also, if you look at the map, it's right next to Iran. So it's kind of like accessible to, so the actual population, although there are Arabs there, maybe a majority, gradually got lots of other people. And you got people, I mean, one of the things and you had these resident in the pre-Islamic version in Uballa, but you also had, people from Java in Indonesia, for example, they'd been there before Islam, but you had already a very cosmopolitan population in the area. And so you've got a cosmopolitan population and you've got religion still in its formative phases in terms of how people understand this. You get a lot of influences and a lot of discussion. So, because each of these other cultures, peoples, would have had their own kind of views. And so, yeah, this, as you say, crucible is a place where all of this is put together. People are working things out, I suppose, because even though maybe certain things were like very much part of Islam at this stage, burial maybe, there's a lot that people that, you know, and from my understanding as an outsider, one of the things I've always thought is interesting about Islam is that it's kind of a very practical religion. I mean, it's very much, you know, the format, the method of prayer and the thing about eating and all this is very practical. But a lot of these practical things, or certain of them, were kind of not really worked out at this early stage in full. And so I think you get all these people kind of thinking about that. And then, yeah, in terms of intellectual things, that thing about the Arabic language, I suppose if you've already got all these different languages kind of going on, some of the Arabs would feel like, even though they're still in Arabia, they might feel some sort of kind of nostalgia for their Arab Bedouin ways. And then on the other hand, you might get new converts who are maybe from, I'll use the extreme version, from Indonesia, Java, or something like that, to whom these desert things are meaningless. And they have kind of their own, and Islam to them means something kind of different, still maybe the same thing, but kind of different. And so they maybe have their own interpretation. And so in that situation, you get many different ideas of kind of what may be important. And so you get the language stuff, and then you get the mysticism, Hassan al-Basri. You get the mysticism, which is kind of like, because, you know, just like when you go to see a film, different people get different things out of it. I think you had this very early on, different people. And so, and there's nothing really set down, no authority. And I think that's possibly both the attraction of that early city, but also we know there were lots of riots and things like that. And we know this is where many early divisions kind of started, because there was all this, nobody kind of really knew what to do. And so everybody's trying different things out. And I think it's also, for me, it's why it's sort of so really interesting, because you can almost feel from that. Because for me, Islam, as much as a religion, it's also a civilization, and I think this is what I see happening here. You're getting a whole civilization developing. It's more than a faith; it's a way of living, and it's stories about how people, you know, live with each other and all sorts of things. So I think it's really kind of very, very interesting in that way. Yeah.
And what led to its political and economic decline after the 3rd century, and its supplanting as a center for scholarship? Did the Zanj revolts have anything to do with this, or the Karamata attack?
Good. Yeah, but both of those, the Zanj, which as you know, the Zanj were probably East African in origin, probably from what today you might call the Swahili area. And because I know that I'm interested in Swahili as well, but so, and we know that these people, and they're brought maybe as slaves, maybe, you know, in different ways. They're brought there, but the reason they're brought there is because they could cope with this very marshy environment, and they could kind of work in the fields. And then, of course, this is kind of many of them became Muslim. And once they became Muslim, they became kind of free, and they wanted to kind of be part of this society, but they had their own interpretation, and so they kind of had their rebellion and established their own kind of place. So that probably had some effect, but and then also what seems to be, in terms of the pottery, in terms of the archaeology, we don't really get anything there from beyond the 11th century. So the site seems to have been abandoned then, and so it could have been for the Karamatite. But the other thing is, and this is again where archaeologists have slightly different kind of ways of looking at things. We also know, apart from the difficulty in freshwater, that some of the water courses were kind of like the navigation channels, so that which actually brought boats, by which trading boats could come into Basra. These were starting not to work anymore. And so it was becoming inconvenient. So if you wanted to export to India, it was no longer, you couldn't just do it from one of the dock sides in Basra. You'd have to go up to the Shatt al Arab or somewhere like that. And so I think as much as any of those raids, I think there's a thing that there's also this kind of long-term thing that it became less accessible by water transport, and in that way it was kind of not such an attractive place to live, because you can imagine the people who actually lived closer to the waterways could just, if you're a trader, I suppose you'd want your warehouse to be there instead. And I think that's probably what happened. And so the thing just shifted because the waterways were not maintained.
Would old Basra have been more populous and prosperous had it been originally located at the more geographically advantageous position of Al Ubula, the position where modern Basra is at?
Yeah, very good question. Very good question. And quite possibly it could have been, but I suppose there's a lot of unknowns here. One is that although this site of Ubula and modern Basra, we assume that they're the same. They may have been in slightly different locations, slightly, but then the modern city of Basra probably would have covered it. So, but there's the question of the which you mentioned before, the pre-existing population. But would it have been more successful? I suppose it could have been, but I think what was attractive about the site we've been talking about, Old Basra, the site next to the desert, what was attractive for the early settlers, and the early settlers were those Arab tribes, what was attractive about it? It was that attachment to the desert. And also that they could live in the way that they wanted to, in terms of they could live in kind of tribal groups, and they weren't kind of predetermined by architecture or street plans or anything like that. So I'd say, and the success of that early civilization in terms of its conquests and people converting to Islam or whatever, however. So I'd say it might have been successful, but I think that early site was really the catalyst for the expansion of this kind of port city. I'd say it's possible. It's possible they could have in Ubala. It's possible they could have, but then that would have involved kind of antagonizing the local population who were already living there. And I think one of the impression I get from elsewhere is that an accommodation with a local population is like kind of fundamental to the success of Islam, actually, because I didn't really talk about it, but you get these other new cities of, like, let's say Kufa, which is Kufa and Najaf. No, sorry, Kufa, which is next to Najaf, but which is also near the ancient city of Al-Hira, the Christian city of Al-Hira, but they kind of formed a new settlement of Kufa. Wasit is the exception, which I won't talk about at the moment, but that was kind of another thing. But I think this idea of new cities is like really important to making it kind of acceptable. So rather than destroying or taking over an existing settlement, you set up a new one, and just by its very existence and the people there, it attracts trade, economics, and becomes kind of successful. And you don't get the conflict because the resident population, then it's not because if you take over people's houses, obviously that's going to be no good. People would be upset by that. But it's so I say its success was the fact that it was not necessarily ideal in other ways.
Thank you. And a very good response. And actually, all of your responses and answers to the questions we've put forth to you have been amazing and thought-provoking. We just have a couple more for you. And
Yeah, good.
thank you for your time so
Good.
far. So how does the archaeology of Islam contribute to interfaith dialogue and foster a better understanding of Islamic history amongst diverse communities?
Okay, yeah. Well, good. I mean, I should say that I live in a place probably in Britain, which has got like kind of probably fewest, I say fewest Muslims, but also as a proportion of the population, but probably also fewest. I mean, it's ethnically not very diverse, put it that way. And so for me, doing what I do, I often have to say things to people, but I think archaeology, Islamic architecture is a very good way of like introducing people to the culture, because to the religion, because people have, non-Muslims have all sorts of, just like everybody has all sorts of preconceptions about things that they know not, that they, because they're busy with their own lives, they don't know anything about it. And if you, I think that if you didn't really know much about, let's say, the Middle East, you think the Middle East is only conflict. You know, that's just because it's what you hear in the news. And if your life is spent doing other things, so I see it has an important role in showing what the faith is about, the culture, the deeper history, the background. And like, because if you understand, if you explain a little bit about people's cultures, I think to people who know nothing about them, you start to understand why things are the way they are, because so I see it as very important like that. So I think it's important to have, apart from academic things, discussions, I think it's important to have things like exhibitions, things like this, available for people to see, for the public to see, because I think it's there's so much that's kind of there's so much misinterpretation, misunderstanding, both amongst non-Muslims and actually with Muslims as well, because for me, another aspect of something that coming from a university academic background, I'm very aware that, let's say, humanities in general in the UK and probably in the US are being kind of downgraded as like, well, what does this contribute to society? How does this, you know, if you can't invent us a new form of heating, what is the point in you learning all of this stuff? But I think humanities, and particularly things like archaeology and history, really help people to understand each other, because we're all products of our history and we're all part of our own culture. And if you don't start to understand why people get very angry about various things, so that's that. So I think it's very important to have and also for it to come from for people just to talk about things. We all know this. When you talk about things become easier to understand and more sort of you can understand somebody else's perspective a lot better, I think.
And I really like what you said in one of your talks, where you said that if the people to which this archaeology is pertaining to find these things valuable, then other people will start finding them valuable. And I think that's another way of kind of building some kind of interfaith and intercultural by people taking value in these things, regardless of who they're coming from. And then they're able to present them or make it interesting for other people to see value in it as well.
Yes, yeah. I think so. Yeah. Um,
And
yes.
in terms of the future of the archaeology of
Yeah.
Islam, what future directions do you see for the fields, and are there any sort of specific areas or topics that you believe deserve more attention, more investigation, more funding?
Yeah. Well, there's a few. One is one is of course the whole thing of the I think DNA analysis, which is something which I think is important, because I'd say because it's being used for all different types of people all over the place. I think it could really contribute to Muslims understanding kind of who they are in some way. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I'd say Islam in Europe, by which I mean not just Spain and Portugal, but and maybe France as well, but also things like, and there have been people working on this, but things like, there's a Tatar community in Poland, for example, and so things like, and I suppose, and then historical connection, because if you go to, I don't know, I mean, it's a long time since I was at school, but if you go to in school in Britain in general, what you learn about, let's say, the Islamic world usually is probably something like the Crusades, and then not much else really. And I think the Crusades is one episode, and it's quite an important episode, but there's all sorts of other types of encounters between Europe and the Islamic world, which are kind of interesting, and trade and like, so for example, one of the things, it's interesting, I can get this in now, I forgot to mention it earlier, but one of the other exports of Basra was probably date syrup, dibus, and they had these special jars which were made in Basra very in the early Islamic period, and they're called, they're like turquoise or greeny blue glazed big jars, and you found them. They've been found as far away as the Philippines and in East Africa, but they've also been found in Britain, in East Anglia as well. So this trade, that's something that archaeology can do, is it shows that somehow, we don't know if it was direct, but somehow pottery from Iraq was arriving in East Anglo-Saxon England, and what, we don't know that. And then there's also, of course, the big connection, and this is something that's sort of been investigated, but there's a lot more to go. This is the links between the Vikings and the Islamic world. And we know there are some, and we know in Sweden, Norway, lots of Islamic coins, mostly silver, have been found, and we know there's some kind of interaction, and that's something that, and we know at a place called Birka, which is near Stockholm, they found an engraved ring with Allah written on it, and they've in a grave, and the question is whether the person was, because it's buried with a woman, whether she's maybe Muslim or not. That's kind of unresolved. But so I think that whole question of those kind of connections is kind of interesting. And again, it's to show, in terms of sort of like, I suppose, Muslims being in Britain and Europe at the moment, it shows that there's always been connections, and also just these, but also, that, I mean, I think, in world terms, Europe, its closest, I suppose the Middle East and North Africa are the closest kind of things, geographical areas, and they're predominantly Muslim. So it's natural that we will have had these connections, but I think they could be explored more. And I think archaeology is quite good to do that, because I think historians don't necessarily mention that you're buying loads of dates from Basra in the medieval wherever, but I think archaeology can actually find those things. And also there's a question that it's tangible. I mean, if you've got pottery to show people, you've got actual things, it feels like more proof. It's something you can understand even if you don't want to read books. I suppose that's what I'd say.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And on that note, I will refer people to your talk on archaeology in Britain concerning
yes.
Islamic artifacts, which is a very interesting talk because I was quite surprised by some of the items that made it all the way up to this island from the Islamic world. And it wasn't at a later period, but at an earlier period. Yeah. So it just shows the trade networks that were going on during this time. Things weren't as segregated as maybe we would like to believe, or what you might get from reading the literature on this time. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. And Professor Petersen, is there anything else that you would like to share with us before we end this? And we greatly appreciate you for coming to speak with us.
Not really. I mean, I think all I'd like to say though is I really value the opportunity to be able to speak like this, and they've been really good questions, and I think this type of thing is kind of important, because I think we mentioned this before, but I think it's, for me, one of the problems. I think, okay, I can talk about, like, let's say, like non-Muslims, there's lots of problems and stuff they have, and of understanding and stuff about them. But I also think it's important for Muslims to kind of take a bit of initiative in terms of understanding their heritage, their cultural heritage, because I think it will not only enriches people, enriches you in terms of like cultural stuff, but also I think it means you don't have to just listen to one person who tells you this is the way things are. You can kind of do your own research and think, well, yeah, maybe this is the way they are, but there's this and this, and just, it means you can kind of be an independent, still have faith, but be independent in that, and kind of make your own. And I think that's kind of I think there's nothing to be afraid of from being kind of critical and looking at kind of evidence. That's all, really.
Thank you for those wise words. Those are probably the best way to end this podcast. And thank you, Professor Petersen, for meeting with us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And I hope to see more work coming from you for us to engage with.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.